The 2025 free agency period begins in just a couple of days away. So in this video, I want to talk about one free agent that every single NFL team should try to sign. If you guys do go on to enjoy the video, hit the like and subscribe button. Let's hop into it. So as I mentioned, we're going to be doing one free agent per team. We are going to do this in alphabetical order, beginning with the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals have a lot of different positional needs. Fortunately for them, they have a good amount of money to spend. I do think one of their issues they should look to address in free agency is offensive line. I think they'll address the defense, primarily the defensive line, in this year's draft. In terms of the one free agent I think they should try and sign, I think they should go after Tevin Jenkins. He's young, yes, he has some injury history, but if he can stay healthy, he's one of the better interior offensive linemen out there in the NFL and out there in free agency. For a team like Arizona, I don't necessarily think they need to go out there and go after a huge name guy, but I think Tevin Jenkins would make a lot of sense. I think he's a good solid scheme fit, and I think personality wise, getting a big bruising physical lineman makes a lot of sense for a team like Arizona. Next up, the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons don't have a lot of money to work with, so unfortunately we can't go after too many big name free agents, but they need to look to address the defensive line quite badly. So I went ahead and decided to go after Azeez Ojulari. Now Azeez is basically a exclusive pass rush guy right now. I will say he hasn't really been given too many opportunities with the New York Giants, but it does appear he's ready to move on, and I think a team like Atlanta could afford a guy who's a little bit on the cheaper end while also could give them elite productivity as a pass rusher. So for Atlanta, you have to address the defensive line. You need pass rush. I think Azeez Ojulari makes a lot of sense. Next up, the Baltimore Ravens. This one might feel a little bit lame, but I'm just going to have them re-signing Ronnie Stanley. I personally think that should be their number one priority this offseason, making sure they bring back their premier offensive tackle for the future. You have to at least bring one of Ronnie Stanley or Patrick Bakari, and I really think that's just about what they can do in terms of free agency, so I have them re-signing Ronnie Stanley. For the Buffalo Bills, I wanted to add a disruptor up the middle who can also be a good run stuffer while also giving you a lot of juice as a pass rusher. So I'm going to go after, and I hope I say his name right, Levi Onwuzurike. I think he's somebody who has been a rotational interior defensive lineman for the Detroit Lions the past couple years, and when he's out there, he's one of the more productive guys on that team. The Buffalo Bills have been tied to so many interior defensive linemen in this upcoming draft. You're looking at guys like Derek Harmon, Talik Williams. Levi Onwuzurike is just somebody who's very similar to those type of guys where you can get him for relatively cheap, but he can also produce at a very high level. Again, he's a good pass rusher. He's also a really solid run stuffer. For a team like Buffalo, they need to address that position quite badly, and I think Levi would be a great start for that unit. Moving on to the Carolina Panthers. Now, the Carolina Panthers don't have the most amount of money, but they definitely can open up a good amount of cap space by cutting a few players and restructuring a couple deals. And for this team, they have a lot of things they need to look to address, primarily on the defensive side of the football. Last year, they were really aggressive to fix up their offensive line and surrounding Bryce Young with some actual playmakers like Xavier Legette and a Deontay Johnson. I think this year they'll be a bit more aggressive to fix the defensive side of things. So I think they're willing to pay a little bit more for the options that are out there in free agency. So for this video, I have them going after Josh Sweat. Josh Sweat is somebody who was uber productive last year as a pass rusher for the Philadelphia Eagles. He hasn't necessarily been a staple of productivity for the Philadelphia Eagles, but whenever he's gotten opportunities, he has made the most of them. And I do think he might get a little bit overpaid in free agency, but a team like Carolina might be the type of team that can muster up the money to pay a guy like Josh Sweat because they're kind of desperate to find as many options defensively as they can get. Moving over to the Chicago Bears, the Chicago Bears have already begun their free agency process, trading for Joe Thuney and trading for Jonah Jackson. Both those guys are awesome additions to the interior of their offensive line, if, of course, those guys can stay healthy, primarily Jonah Jackson, who struggled with injuries this past couple years. So for this team, I think they really need to look to address the defensive side of the football, primarily finding another edge rusher next to Montez Sweat. Now, there's a lot of really good options out there, and I could have went with a bunch of different names, but I kind of think this Chicago Bears team might be looking for somebody with a little bit more proven productivity, who's also still relatively young. And there's not a lot of great options out there, but I do think Hassan Reddick makes a little bit of sense for this team. Obviously, 2024 was just a bizarre year for Hassan Reddick. He didn't perform that well, and he just didn't play much because of contract issues. I think it seemed like Chicago could be willing to muster up the money to bring him in on maybe like a 1 or 2 year deal to see if he can kind of regain his 2023-2024 film when he was playing with the Philadelphia Eagles. If he can be that guy for the Chicago Bears team, I think they'd have an awesome pass rushing duo of Montez Sweat and Hassan Reddick think this one kind of makes a little bit of some sense. Moving to the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals have a lot of question marks this offseason. What happens with T. Higgins? Are they able to bring back Trey Hendrickson? Can they get contracts done with Jamar Chase? And so many big-time questions. But for this team, they also have to look to address their defense. Last year, this defense was just simply put not good at all. Secondary's weak, defensive line's weak. This defense just needs a bit of a complete overhaul. And I think a good way to kind of start off this overhaul is by going for a younger pass rusher who didn't perform at all last year due to injury, but has shown the ability to get you close to 8 to 10 sacks a season, and that's going to be Malcolm Koonce. Now, Malcolm Koonce probably won't get a long-term deal with the Cincinnati Bengals, but maybe a 1 to 2 year deal where he gets a nice little pay increase, can play hopefully opposite of Trey Hendrickson and have a bounce back year, and then hopefully within the next couple years can get that bigger, more massive extension. A team like Cincinnati isn't going to go out there and pay their players too much money. I don't think Koonce would cost them all that much. They could also look to address depth in the defensive line in this year's draft. I think bringing a guy like Malcolm Koonce in, you're instantly getting a starter at a somewhat affordable price. Moving on to the Cleveland Browns, this is a team that has a bunch of issues they need to look to address. With Jedrick Wills likely out the door, I think that offensive tackle should be a priority for them in this year's offseason. Obviously, the quarterback position is going to be one that is extremely interesting to see what they ultimately do, whether they go for a Shador or a Cam Ward or somebody in free agency. Ultimately, I think you have to support your quarterback with a good offensive lineman, and that's going to bring me to a younger prospect who hasn't necessarily always been great, but I thought last year really took a nice step forward, and it looks like he's starting to enter into his actual prime, and that is Dan Moore Jr. Now, right now, Dan Moore Jr. is looking at about a $13 million per year contract, which is really accessible for a team like Cleveland. I think they'll likely stick him out at right tackle, which will be a bit new for him. But man, this is somebody who has really developed nicely through his career. His first couple years, he really struggled in pass protection. But last year, I thought he took a nice step forward, was a really big positive for that Steelers team. And honestly, I think the Steelers would be wise to re-sign him. For a team like Cleveland, I think getting a young offensive tackle who has proven the ability to grow and get better and just keep maturing. And I think for the Cleveland Browns, you got to support a young quarterback. And I think Dan Moore would be a guy who can do that. Next up, the Dallas Cowboys. This Cowboys team has a lot of different question marks, and as we know, this Cowboys team is typically not aggressive in free agency, though they've been kind of aggressive to start off the offseason so far, restructuring deals like there's rumors about Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, getting off of certain contracts, re-signing certain players a little bit early, like Osa Digazua. By the way, really good contract. So I think this team might be a little bit more aggressive, but as I think they've said, they'll be selectively aggressive, meaning they won't go out there and sign a huge name guy. But I do think one player who makes a lot of sense to add to this Cowboys team would be linebacker Jamien Sherwood. The Dallas Cowboys right now, if they bring back Eric Kendricks, their starting linebacking duo would be Kendricks, who's really old at this point, who actually had a really good year, but is obviously older. And then they would have I think their third round rookie or fourth round rookie in Leafau as their other linebacker. Obviously, DeMarvion Overshown is the long-term plan to be their starting linebacker, but I just think that there's question marks with that position. Jamien Sherwood is young. He's awesome. He's an absolute missile as a linebacker. You pair him next to hypothetically DeMarvion Overshown, and if that does end up working out where Overshown comes back from injury, you have a really awesome linebacking trio with Leafau also developing. But if, for whatever reason, Overshown can't come back from this injury and just doesn't look like his usual self, then you have Sherwood and Leafau, and I think you feel pretty confident about those guys moving forward. Very athletic player. In fact, if Dallas would bring in a Jamien Sherwood, all three of their starting linebackers, hypothetically speaking, when healthy, would be absolute freakishly athletic. Next up, the Denver Broncos. You need to support your young quarterback in Bo Nix. Get him some more weapons, primarily a tight end that can also block a little bit, but can also give you a lot of different things in the receiving game. And that ultimately led me to Juwan Johnson. Now, this is not a great tight end free agency class, and you might be a bit more obligated to go out there and wait till the draft to go after a Colston Loveland, or if a Tyler Warren falls, maybe you go there. My thing is, I think you want a bit more of a proven guy who you know what you're going to be getting from instantly. You look at a Colston Loveland, Mason Taylor, or Gunnar Helm, those guys, I don't know what you're getting out of them in their rookie seasons. Like, those are guys who I just don't know if you're going to be instantly getting a huge impact player. Juwan Johnson could very well be an impact player. Plus, if you bring in a Juwan Johnson, it's not like you can't take a younger player in like the third or fourth round, like a Mason Taylor, for example. Next up, the Detroit Lions. A lot of question marks with the offensive line, so I think this one makes a good amount of sense. I have them bringing in Mekhi Becton. Mekhi Becton is huge. He's physical. He really improved improved last year with the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, granted, everyone improves with the Philadelphia Eagles because those guys just find ways to bring in players, improve their stock, and then get those guys paid. Mekhi Becton very well could be the next guy up. And for a team like Detroit that had a lot of injuries last year, Kevin Zeitler's a free agent. You might be a bit more aggressive this year while you still have a little bit of open cap space. Mekhi Becton could be that young addition to the interior of your offensive line who's big, physical, nasty, kind of fits in the mold of what you want on this team. Mekhi Becton, to me, makes a bunch of sense for the Detroit Lions, especially if they do not re-sign Kevin Zeitler. Next up, the Green Bay Packers. They need a proven pass rusher desperately, badly next to Rashawn Gary. They just have nobody they can consistently rely upon, and that ultimately brought me to Khalil Mack. The Packers actually have a good amount of cap space available, and they can open up a lot more. Khalil Mack will likely want to go to a contending team while also getting paid pretty nicely. If he wants to do so, I think the Packers are one of the top destination choices for him. For the Packers, it makes a lot of sense. You want a proven commodity who can be a good run stuffer while also being an excellent pass rusher. And for Khalil Mack, you want to get paid while going to a team that has a chance to contend. Kind of feels like a really solid marriage in my opinion. Moving to the Houston Texans. The Houston Texans have huge offensive line issues. You feel relatively okay about certain positions, like you know what you're getting in Titus Howard, you know what you're getting from Laramie Tunsil, but the rest of the offensive line needs a little bit of work, especially when, you know, this is going to be a team that is trying to contend next year. So I think they should be relatively aggressive to go out there and try to find a top tier offensive lineman. You feel pretty good about Nico Collins, and I think you'll address the other receiver position in this year's draft, maybe in Emeka Egbuka, Matthew Golden, or somebody along those lines. For the Houston Texans, though, I have them addressing their guard position in Kevin Zeitler. Ironically, the Detroit Lions were replacing Kevin Zeitler with Mekhi Becton because the Houston Texans, in my opinion, should go after Kevin Zeitler. He's a veteran guy. He's proven. Yes, he's a little bit older, and yes, you're probably not signing him to a 3 or 4 year deal, but the Houston Texans window is right now, and they have to find guys who can instantly step in there and make plays for them and help them protect CJ Stroud, and Kevin Zeitler can do that at an extremely high level. He's also probably not going to be that expensive. Like, I only expect a 1 year deal upwards of like $10 to $12 million a year, if even that. So if you're Houston, I think this one makes a lot of sense. In fact, I think for a lot of teams, Kevin Zeitler makes sense, but primarily for Houston, where the interior of the offensive line has been such a massive issue, Zeitler comes in there, instantly fixes that, and isn't terribly expensive. Next up, the Indianapolis Colts. This team has had a really interesting past couple years lately, and I think they'll look to address their offense in this year's draft. The offensive line, they have a couple question marks as to who's going to come back and what they can do there, but I think defensively is really where you want to make your money spent here. And for me, I think one free agent that hasn't gotten talked about too much, but I think would make a good addition here for the Indianapolis Colts would be Javon Holland. Javon Holland is a bit more of your strong safety guy who also has a little bit of flexibility to play more as a free safety. With Julian Blackmon a free agent, if you do bring him back, he can be your free safety. If not, Javon Holland instantly steps in there, gives the safety room a stable body who can also be really successful as a run stuffer as well when he needs to be. I think Javon Holland makes sense for the Indianapolis Colts. Moving to the Jacksonville Jaguars, this team has got to look to address the cornerback room this offseason, whether it's in the draft or whether it's in free agency. There isn't a great name available in free agency. Like, there's a couple names out there, but I think a good start for the Jacksonville Jaguars would be a guy like DJ Reed. Now, I'll say this, DJ Reed probably wants to go to a contending team, but hey, money talks, and the Jacksonville Jaguars have some money to spend, so I would not be surprised if the Jacksonville Jaguars be a little bit more aggressive to address their secondary to really start to build up this defense, and then in the draft maybe support Trevor Lawrence with some pieces in the later rounds of the draft. For cornerback in this year's draft class, you're looking at Jahdae Barr and Will Johnson, and those guys are definitely on the table for Jacksonville, but I think they're likely targeting Mason Graham to address the interior defensive line. By picking up DJ Reed, you're getting a really solid cornerback 1 who I think is better suited as a cornerback 2, but for a team like Jacksonville, he'll likely be their cornerback 1 for the time being. Moving to Kansas City, they have a lot of free agents they need to look to re-sign. Trey Smith, who I believe just got franchise tagged, but we'll see if he signs a long-term deal. Nick Bolton, their safety, DeAndre Hopkins, they got a lot of players to look to re-sign, and then there's obviously the question marks with Travis Kelce, though I've heard that he's probably returning. For this team, they don't have a ton of money to spend in free agency, but there are a couple really cheap veterans that I think would make a lot of sense for this Chiefs team. The one I came up up with was Taylor Tart. He's somebody who can play behind Chris Jones, alongside Chris Jones. He's a good disruptor, great in stuffing, can get you a little bit of juice as a pass rusher. Just a solid player that's really affordable, which I think this Chiefs team should be really looking for. Next up, the Las Vegas Raiders. A lot of question marks to go into this offseason. Who plays quarterback? Who's their number one receiver? Who's going to be their running back? One way that you can kind of eliminate some of those questions would be addressing the cornerback room. Charvarius Ward is available. He's probably going to be out of San Francisco. Right down the road is Las Vegas, where he can get out of California, go to a great area near Las Vegas, and I think it makes some sense for the Raiders to want to go out there and bring in a guy who has proven to be a good cornerback one. Obviously, 2024 wasn't his greatest season, but we all know the circumstances. I think he'd be better suited to get out of there, go to a nearby area where he can kind of reset things, and I think the Raiders would have the money to spend, and they would have the opportunity for Charvarius Ward to stick in as a cornerback one. Next up, the LA Chargers. This team has a good amount of money to spend, but I'm going to pick up a free agent that I don't think I've heard people talk about too much for them, and I think it makes a good amount of sense. I have them going for DeAndre Hopkins. Now, I know people instantly are going to be like, what? DeAndre Hopkins? Why would they go after him? Well, I don't think T. Higgins is leaving Cincinnati, and that would be my number one guy for the Chargers. So who's the next best outside receiver to pair next to Ladd McConkey and Quentin Johnston? Maybe you could look at Amari Cooper, but I think I'd prefer DeAndre Hopkins at this point, although if you say Amari Cooper, I don't have an issue with that. Chris Godwin's a bit more of an inside guy. I don't view him as being a traditional outside receiver. Same thing with Stephon Diggs. So really your best option is DeAndre Hopkins. Yes, you can look at the draft, but I don't really know there's a guy out there who does that. Like Emeka Egbuka is a bit more of a slot guy. Matthew Golden, I think, would be a bit more of an outside guy, but he doesn't have the size element to him. Obviously, Ted McMillan would be there, but I don't think he goes that late. So if you're a team like the LA Chargers who wants size, who can win the 50-50 balls, and maybe he doesn't have to be a go-to guy, I think DeAndre Hopkins actually makes a good amount of sense. Obviously, Ladd McConkey continues to be that receiver one, but D-Hop can step in and be a wide receiver two, build a rapport with Justin Herbert, and I think it makes some sense. Next up, the LA Rams. Now, I know I talked about DeAndre Hopkins going to the LA Chargers, but recently there's been another new addition to free agency, and that's going to be Davante Adams. Now, for the sake of the LA Rams, you'd have to open up a good amount of money, but for Davante Adams, he probably wants to go out there and try and contend for a championship. The LA Rams were really close last year to beating the eventual champions in the Philadelphia Eagles. They're likely moving off of Cooper Kupp to try to bring in some new pieces and some new guys. If you're the LA Rams, you realize your window's probably closing as Matthew Stafford's kind of ending career these next few years. So if you want to go all in, bringing a guy in like Davante Adams, I think makes this LA Rams team legit Super Bowl contenders next year. Their defense took a big step forward last year. Yes, they need to look to address the cornerback position, but they'll probably do that in the draft. Offensive line has a couple question marks, but you brought back Alaric Jackson. That solves a huge issue. You bring back Matthew Stafford. If you get Davante Adams on this team, pair him next to Puka Nacua, yeah, this thing can get pretty nasty real quick. Next up, the Miami Dolphins. They got to look to address the offensive line. Protect Tua Tagovailoa, your big dollar man. Will Fries is out there, and I think he'd present a good natural scheme fit while also presenting a guy who is just really solid. Now, I do think he struggled with an injury last year and was out for a big chunk of the season, but Will Fries has proven that he can be a great player. The Dolphins are pretty desperate to fix that position. They don't actually have a ton of money, so I don't know where they'll get the money from, but they'll figure it out. Moving over to the Minnesota Vikings, a lot of question marks with this Vikings team. Are they going to bring back Sam Darnold, or are they going to rock with JJ McCarthy? From what I've heard, it sounds like they're going to try to work a deal out with Sam Darnold, which that's pretty interesting. But for the sake of the Minnesota Vikings, they do have a lot of other positional needs. Running back, defensive interior, secondary, those are all pretty big needs. So I wanted to address at least one of those needs, and that's going to be the interior, the defensive line. They really don't have too many big name guys. Like Harrison Phillips is a decent player, but outside of him, they don't really have anyone that you feel terribly confident in. I'm going to target BJ Hill. Now, BJ Hill is just, I don't really know how to describe it other than just saying he's extremely solid. He's a good run stuffer, not a great run stuffer, but a good run stuffer. He's a good pass rusher, not a great pass rusher, but he's a good pass rusher. And for the sake of the Minnesota Vikings, I think BJ Hill would just step in there instantly and just be a really solid interior defensive lineman, which you never complain about. You need to find as many consistent, just good players, and I think BJ Hill could be that. Next up, the New England Patriots. Now, I don't know exactly what's going on with this player, but he potentially might be getting franchise tagged, so that maybe does really kind of ruin this little pipe dream here. But hypothetically speaking, if he doesn't want to re-sign with this team, or if he doesn't want to sign the franchise tag, maybe he could find his way out of the team. I'm going to target Trey Smith. Again, I think he's going to get franchise tagged, so that presents a number of different issues, but this Patriots team needs to look to address the offensive line so desperately badly. They need to protect protect their franchise quarterback in Drake May. They have so much money to hand out that, I mean, if they talk to Trey Smith and say, hey man, we'll give you $30 million a year, I mean, like, I wouldn't play for the Chiefs if I'm getting 30 mil from New England, just saying. So I'm sure there's a way they can get it done, but man, if they can find a way to get Trey Smith, it would just seriously improve this offensive line so badly, which, my God, please protect Drake May, my God. Next up, the New Orleans Saints. The Saints are in absolute salary cap hell, so there is no player that I can really go out there and honestly see signing with the New Orleans Saints, but they'll probably look to address with some veteran guys who are on like 1 or 2 year deals, so they don't have any long-term financial commitments to them, while also still trying to somewhat compete out there. The best name I could come out here with was Baron Browning. He's relatively young, but has kind of been a little bit inconsistent at times. In 2022 to 2023, he had a 14.2% pressure rate, and these past few years, he hasn't really been the same guy. Last year, he had a PFF grade of 58.0, 2023 of 74.5. So I do think a team like New Orleans could be willing to take a bit of a flyer on a younger guy on like a 1-year prove-it deal. If it works out, then great, you have a pass rusher of the future, but if it obviously doesn't, then it is what it is. It's only a 1-year deal. Next up, the New York Giants. I think the New York Giants need to find some answer at quarterback, whether it's a veteran or a long-term play. There are a lot of different options out there, but ultimately, I'm going to have them going after Justin Fields. Now, hear me out on this one. I don't think Justin Fields should be their starter next year. I think they should try to find every which way and form to trade up to get Cam Ward, which very well could end up happening. But if you, for whatever reason, cannot get a trade done to get a quarterback, and let's just hypothetically say that Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders will not go to the New York Giants, I think you need to have a backup plan, and I think Justin Fields could be a potential backup plan. You don't have to pay him too much money. You don't have to give him a long-term deal. So if you are the ownership of the New York Giants, and there's question marks with the head coach and with the owner, if you don't want to have a long-term commitment at quarterback, bringing Justin Fields in on a 1-year prove-it deal could kind of be a beneficial sort of mutual agreement. Moving to the New York Jets, I think the New York Jets need to find another receiver next to Garrett Wilson right now. I mean, who do they have? They still have Allen Lazard? I don't even know at this point. They really have absolutely nothing next to him. And I think they could really benefit from having a big playmaking guy who, in a lot of ways, I think would be a perfect marriage next to Garrett Wilson, and that's Darius Slayton. Now, yes, Darius Slayton's coming from the Giants and probably wants to find a contending team, but hey, man, low moving cost. You stay right in your same spot. You go to the same stadium every single week. Would make a little bit of sense for Darius Slayton to stay in New York and go to a team like the Jets that need a wide receiver too. Could really use somebody of the skill set of Darius Slayton who could do a bit more of stretching. You know, he can stretch the field vertically. He can win the 50-50 balls. He's also a pretty decent route runner. And obviously Garrett Wilson can work a bit more of the inside while also staying on the outside here and there as well. Just think it'd make for a nice little marriage. And then I think you look to find a wide receiver 3 either in free agency or potentially later in the draft. Next up, the Philadelphia Eagles. This is another team that just should probably look to re-sign one of their big name free agents. So similar to Baltimore, be a little boring here and just say Zach Bond. Zach Bond was so unbelievably good for this team last year. Really a big breakout year. And if I'm Philadelphia, I don't think I want to waste the chance of bringing back Zach Bond to really keep up this defense and have another run at it next year. So a little boring, but yeah, I'm just going to have them going after Zach Bond. Next up, Pittsburgh Steelers. You need to find a cornerback too next to Joey Porter Jr. Asante Samuel Jr. instantly steps in there, is fantastic in coverage. Yes, he struggles to tackle in open space, but man, really sticky in coverage. You have Joey Porter Jr. be a bit more of your aggressive downhill thumper when you need him to. So I think Asante Samuel Jr. can step in there, make some big time plays in coverage, and really help out this secondary. Next up, the San Francisco 49ers. We're actually going to stick with secondary here. Renardo Green had a really good rookie year, but outside of him, you don't really have too many different options out there. You would like to find a veteran who can instantly step in there and be a cornerback 1/2, depending on what happens in the rest of the draft and free agency. I think Carlton Davis makes a lot of sense. He probably wants to stay on a team that still has a chance to contend. Obviously, he was with Detroit last year. I think Detroit would be wise to bring him back, but if he does test free agency, I do think the 49ers should go after him. Charvarius Ward is likely out the door. You need to look to replace him. Carlton Davis steps in there, is extremely sticky in coverage, really good playmaker, so I just think it'd make a lot of sense. Next up, Seattle. You need to find a nose tackle up the middle. You obviously have Jaron Reed there. We'll see what happens there. You have Byron Murphy, who also plays in sort of your edge rushing 3-4 kind of role. I think you need a bit more of a true nose tackle, and I think that's kind of what you're going to get in Calais Campbell. Now, Calais Campbell, obviously older veteran guy who even knows if he'll even play next year, but if he does, which I'm assuming he will, we're looking at somebody who just, my God, is just so unbelievably productive, even though he's damn near 40 years old. He's somebody who can step in there, be excellent as your traditional nose tackle, while also still somehow, some way giving you juice as a pass rusher. For Seattle, you need to find that guy who can be a good run stuffer while also presenting a good pass rush element, and that's what you're getting in Calais Campbell. Moving to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, now they don't have a ton of cap space to work with, but they can kind of make some financial maneuvers to open up a bit more space. Obviously, a lot of that money is going to go probably to re-signing Chris Godwin, but if they can open up a little bit of extra money, I think going after Nick Bolton would make a lot of sense. Right now, there's a lot of question marks with both your linebackers. Levante David is, I think, 35 years old. Does he retire soon? Does he come back? I don't really know. Either way, you need to get a little bit younger in that room. Bringing in Nick Bolton, who, yes, sometimes can struggle in coverage, but is excellent as a run defender. I think it makes sense for Tampa Bay to go out there and spend a little bit bigger on a premier linebacker to really solidify this defense moving forward. Moving to the Tennessee Titans, you need to look to address the right tackle spot. I kind of think you move JC Latham out to right tackle and look to find a left tackle. And for me, there's a couple names out there you could definitely go for, but I want to find somebody who I know what I'm getting out of them. I don't want a bit of a project or a question mark. I want somebody who I know 1000% will be good for me, and that ultimately brought me to Cam Robinson. Now, Cam Robinson will be a bit more expensive, but Tennessee could easily afford him. He can play left tackle. I think he can play right tackle, but you just kind of have to test that out to see what's the best makeup of the offensive line. But you brought in JC Latham last year. He had an up and down rookie season, but obviously you hope that he's your future guy. Cam Robinson could step in there, be a veteran alongside JC Latham to help kind of get him going in his path, while at the same time just being a damn good offensive tackle for what you're going to assume is going to be a new quarterback in 2024. And lastly, the Washington Commanders. This team has so many different moves they could go out there and make this offseason. You could go after a receiver, but they just brought in Deebo Samuel, so maybe that's not that big of a need. They probably should look to address offensive line in the free agency market, but I think one name that would really make this defense significantly better would be Rasul Douglas. Now, you brought in Marshawn Lattimore via trade last year, and he was a little bit up and down last year. He didn't have the greatest time out there. He was kind of coming back from an injury, so we'll have to wait and see what he looks like next year. And then, of course, Mike Sainristil was fantastic, but you need to find that cornerback too next to Lattimore and Sainristil, as Sainristil more of a nickel more so than outside corner, though he can play outside corner. And Rasul Douglas to me just makes a lot of sense. Now, last year wasn't his greatest year, but for the most part, you know what you're getting in the guy. He's excellent in coverage, and he can make some plays on the ball as well. For Buffalo, it would be a big time loss as he's kind of their true cornerback one. For Rasul Douglas's sake, he could still be technically a cornerback one for Washington, with Lattimore being more of that cornerback two, but for sake of argument, I don't think it really matters who's CB1 and who's CB2. You just have two fantastic corners, and Mike Sainristil is a fantastic slot guy. But you guys let me know in the comment section below, which player would you like to see on your favorite team? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button. Love you guys. Peace.